Antonia, your books obviously rely on diaries and archives and letters and all those things that the historian needs, especially going back into earlier centuries. You don't have the benefit of memory. What is, or talking to live people, what's your favourite source? I mean, what do you trust and not trust?
There was a wonderful historian, Antony may know whether it was my hero Maitland or not, who said about documents, we must always ask ourselves why and for what purpose did this document come into existence. And I think that really, I can see one or two people nodding, because if you think about it, a letter written, posted, whatever form the post then took, that vanishes from the person who wrote it. So it's first-hand, it is not corrupted by memory or revisionism. An ambassador's report, ditto, like a letter, very valuable. At the same time, the ambassador of Spain, the Spanish ambassador, I mean, reporting on Queen Elizabeth, has got a lot, sort of, you know, he's got a lot of angles. On the other hand, a memoir, written by definition after the event, has got even more agenda, you know. So I think that is a very important maxim, really. What have we got here? I think everybody does, I love going to the original. With Mary Queen of Scots, her handwriting began by being beautiful, sort of Roman, unlike the handwriting of Queen Elizabeth, which is a sort of nightmare. This is not a judgment, simply a statement. And then as she got more and more unhappy and more sick and in captivity, her handwriting becomes like a sort of exercise in handwriting. It gets larger and larger and larger. And, you know, it's said if your handwriting slopes down, you're suffering from depression. And her handwriting sort of starts going down and goes down and down. I mean, that's absolutely magic. I remember being in the Archives Nationales in Paris when I was working on Marie Antoinette. And they said, we have one wardrobe book, which are these huge books, really, I mean, bigger than any book here, in which would have swatches of material on either side of the page, like 6 swatches. And then she would prick it with a pin for the 4 outfits she wore that day. And then it would be taken away, and she did this in bed. And only one of these books, these amazing books, only one survived the revolution, and it's in the Archives Nationales, which is Rue Franc-Bourgeois, somewhere like that. And I was allowed to see it. I discovered, they don't sort of advertise it, but I discovered it was there, and you know, I got there. Then I had to put on white gloves, which is highly appropriate for Marie Antoinette, so I put on white gloves with pleasure. And then I was led and I was sat down, and then a sort of uniformed person brought me the book, at which point I was aware that behind me were 2 armed, and I mean armed gendarmes, you know, the French police, like that, sort of very close. And I went in that panic, you know you mustn't do something like blotting it, you know. I sort of thought, is the Bastille still in action? You know, if I suddenly sort of, I don't know, drop a blob of ink, not that I was allowed ink. And so I sort of mixed between terror and excitement. And that first-hand experience and seeing the pricks and, you know, where she actually sat, that was so vivid for me. And those are, in a way, everyone has low moments. You think, why do I do this? Who cares? And everything. But it's those moments of first-hand contact which make it all worthwhile. I mean, I'm sure you have moments like that.
Well, just on the subject of sources, I mean, like you, I find diaries, you used the word agenda.
Yeah.
I think diaries sometimes are written with an eye to posterity or spin,
yeah.
But letters you can trust. So now I'm going to ask you, when you wrote your own book about yourself, were you as strict with yourself as you are with your subjects? I'm sure you relied
which
your
book?
Present book. I'm sure you relied upon diaries to.
Well, no, I thought you meant Must You Go, a book about my life with Harry.
Well, either. When you've written about your own life, are you as strict on yourself as you are on your other subjects?
I tell you something. I'm not a perfect decent, wonderful character. I can lie. Oh no, officer, I just had no idea, you know, with the best of them. But I can't lie in my diary. I just couldn't. I couldn't write something in my diary. It might be rather fun, actually, but I couldn't. I just couldn't do it. And so everything I quote from my diaries in Must You Go is there. Of course, I don't write everything in my diary. It'd be rather boring apart from anything else. With my history, which is, of course, up till the age of 23 and then leaps forward to the publication of Mary Queen of Scots, I had little pocket diaries, those tiny little things. And those were useful correcting chronology. I'd suddenly find that I went to France in 1947, not 1948, that kind of thing. They weren't very interesting. I mean, I got out of bed and shortly afterwards I went back to bed, you know, that kind of thing. I had breakfast more often than not. Wasn't interesting, but what was fascinating, which my mother, may God rest her soul, kept all my letters from school. I was 4 years in a boarding school. And I kept all her letters to me, all during the Labour government of 45, when my father became a minister. And I was at boarding school from 44 to 48. And she's merrily reporting there's a new young hotshot called Harold Wilson, you know, sort of things like that. That's posted to St Mary's Ascot, not subject to any revision. And that was absolutely riveting, actually.
Jolly useful,
yeah.
Yes. And Antony, I have to ask you about sources because your work is more recent, so you can rely on interviews, eyewitness testimony, documents, archives, all sorts. But how do you weigh up? Because there's a very lively controversy today about the reliability of memory and, you know, will the Holocaust be recorded only by those who have survived? Children, so they have a very skewed view.
Absolutely.
I just wonder what you feel about using real people as opposed to documents.
Real people can be very, very useful in certain circumstances. I haven't used them, though, for the last sort of few books. But in certain circumstances, by that I mean they can correct things or inform you of things you don't quite understand from the archives, you know. They can tell you about some material which is, or detail, say, of slang, or explain various things in that particular way. But I was very struck when I was doing Stalingrad. It was the same time as Anne Applebaum was doing her Gulag book. And so we used to meet for dinner occasionally in Moscow and exchange notes. And on one occasion, where we were, in fact, the first time we met up for dinner, Anne said, "Is it just me? But every time I try to interview a Gulag survivor, they tell me to sit down, don't interrupt, I'll tell you what happened." And I said, "No, I promise you, it's not because you're a woman." I mean, that was what I thing at the time. I said, "It's actually because they want to sort of control things like that. I get the same thing from Red Army soldiers." And we both agreed, actually, the Russian women far more reliable than any of the men. And it was only rarely as I took the metro back to where I was staying in North Moscow that evening that it sort of really struck me. The men, of course, had been humiliated during the course of the war, not by their own officers, by their commissars and all the rest of it. And now, finally, they could reimpose their version of history on these foreign historians coming to interview them. The women, on the other hand, had kept their eyes open, their mouths shut, and, in terms of sort of detail and all the rest of it, I thought they were much more interesting. On the other side, in Germany, of course, there were a number of cases where I was sort of interviewing people who'd been in the bunker with Hitler. It was rather strange when you shook hands thinking that hand has shaken Hitler's hand. And I mean, it did sort of rather strike one in that particular way. It was a question of sort of working one's way through them. But I mean, there are certain sources, like, for example, the diaries, kept rather as entirely, as Antonia was saying, the need to testify in a way. I mean, the diaries kept by women in Berlin during the sort of the collapse at the end were not only, I mean, they were astonishingly perceptive and accurate, because one could always sort of verify it from other versions, because they felt, you know, they knew they were living through a major moment in history, and so they wanted to record it exactly. There's no greater no greater diary really from the Second World War than a Berlin diary, which is that anonymous one.
Yeah.
So those, on the whole, are very valid. One of the most, of course, absolute gold in the National Archives were the tapes, or rather the records, made when this is called the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centres, where German generals were imprisoned. And there were German Jews working for the British who were listening into their conversations. And as soon as they were starting to say anything interesting, then they immediately put on one of these sort of discs to record it. And there in the National Archives, you have the original German transcript of their conversations. And there you have word for word exactly what was said. And of course, they were incredibly revealing of what their attitudes, whether it was towards the SoA, to the Holocaust, or whether it was towards the Allies and so forth. And it was absolutely, I mean, there you do know how you have sort of the real thing. I mean, you can't get better than that.
So it's a mixture of all of them. And
I think you get a nose. I think you get a nose after a time for when something is slightly false or something too good to be true. And I remember when I was starting on Stalingrad, sorry, very quickly, I was starting on Stalingrad, there was a great bestseller in the 1950s called Last Letters from Stalingrad. And I read this and I was bowled over by it. And then you start to think afterwards, hang on, is that too good to be true? And usually it is when it's too good to be true. And in fact, afterwards, what one found was that actually these had been, these actually had been completely faked by a German officer who was in charge of the propaganda company of the Sixth Army. And he'd completely rewritten them. And you knew that there was something seriously wrong.